Yuma everyone, which is hello in Ngunnawal, and happy International Human Rights Day. Thank you for making it here in person to CMAG and for people here online to celebrate. We are recording from now and we are live streaming. I'm Helen Watchirs, the President and Human Rights Commissioner, and I'll facilitate today's event on behalf of my colleague commissioners Karen Tui, Jodie Griffiths-Cook and Heidi Yates. And this is our 19th International Human Rights Day Forum. I'd like to invite Mary Mudford from EPSDD to perform a Welcome to Country in Ngunnawal language. Thank you so much, Mary.
Yuma. Thank you, Helen, for inviting me to undertake the Welcome to Country today. I'd just like to thank everyone for being here in the room with us and for this wonderful forum today celebrating the International Human Rights Day. And I would also like to acknowledge Helen for bringing together, and her team, for bringing together this wonderful forum. Yuma, Yungul, I'm going to start again. Yuma, Daura Nuna Wawari. Yungul, Nalawiri, Dune Manyan, Ningara Dindi, Yinjamari Leginian, Yumalundi. Hello, this is Ngunnawal country. We gathered here today on Ngunnawal country. We respect elders, both male and female. Welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary, for your wise and deep words and your work on country that's so ongoing that we really appreciate. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and I respect their continuing culture, the oldest in the world at over 65,000 years, and protected under Section 27(2) of the Human Rights Act. Please take a copy if you haven't got one already from out the front. I pay my respects to elders past, present and future and support the 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart and referendum for a voice to Parliament. And I acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in person or attending online. The theme for 2022 is a time to act about explicitly recognising the right to a healthy environment in the Human Rights Act as recently committed to by the ACT government and will be discussed at our opening by Minister Cheyne. It's incredibly timely because we've seen so much action recently. The Waratah coal case in Queensland was decided by the Land Court to be a breach of human rights, so the recommendation of that court is not to go ahead. Waratah Coal, owned by Clive Palmer, is actually 4 times bigger than Adani, so it's a very significant decision. It was upheld in terms of human rights, the Queensland Human Rights Act about Aboriginal and cultural rights, children's rights, privacy rights. So a really good precedent. And we've had a UN Human Rights Committee case only in September this year about Torres Strait Islanders with rising sea levels being a breach of similar human rights. So there is international jurisprudence happening now in Australia. We have had the issue considered in the first year of the 2004 Human Rights Act. In 2005 there was a Greens amendment to consider that, and again in 2010 the 5-year review of the Act looking at economic, social and cultural rights. But neither of those successfully led to amendments, but really great, and it's the first Human Rights Community Forum where the government's agreed in advance, so very great to be here successfully in advance. I'd like to acknowledge Minister Cheyne and Minister for Environment Rebecca Vassarotti and Joe Clay, MLA. We had been expecting Shane Rattenbury and Gordon Ramsay, but I think they may attend later because they're very busy. In terms of housekeeping, could the live audience please mute your phones because we are recording, and the live stream audience, can you please turn on your captioning device so that you have an accessible experience with us today. I'd now like to invite the Minister for Human Rights, Cheyne, to formally open this community forum. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Helen. And Yuma, I'd also like to add my voice in acknowledging the traditional custodians and paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extending that respect and welcome to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today and joining us online. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Thanks also to all of you and particularly to our guest speakers for giving up your time to mark this very important discussion on International Human Rights Day. And as Dr Watchirs noted, the subject of today's forum is particularly timely. And it's not least because yesterday the federal government responded to Professor Graham Samuel's 2019 review into the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. As part of that response, we will have a federal Environment Protection Agency for the first time. Yeah. I think it's well understood that this was a report that had been ignored by the previous government, and I am just so pleased and feel quite refreshed that the new government and Minister Plibersek are taking environment protection seriously. For our own part in the ACT, we are continuing to strengthen our EPA, and can I acknowledge the presence of Dr Sue Wildriver, who leads the EPA in the ACT. In this year's budget, we hired 2 additional environment protection officers to support compliance monitoring and regulatory oversight, and they are doing a lot of work with industry to prevent environmental harm before it happens. And can I encourage you, if you haven't met Dr Sue before, perhaps during the lunch that you do acquaint yourself with her, because her energy is infectious. We've also had significant work underway to develop a 3-year action plan to reform and to modernise the ACT's environmental protection framework, and Minister Vassarotti and I are working very closely on that. I don't think there's any doubt in this room about the value of these actions collectively and individually and the impact that they will have. But we consider that there is also another pressing consideration, and that is the right to a healthy environment. That a healthy environment be expressed as a human right. A conversation, as Dr Watchirs noted, that we have been having in the ACT for some time. But just last week, a right that we firmly committed to legislating in this term of Parliament, so within the next 2 years. This will be an Australian first, and it will follow many other firsts. We were the first in Australia to introduce a Human Rights Act, the first to declare a climate emergency, the first to transition to 100% renewable energy, and we've led the way across a range of actions to mitigate our changing environment and reduce biodiversity loss. Connecting through green spaces in and around our capital cities are part of what makes Canberra, Canberra, and one of the most livable cities in the world, if not the most livable city in the world. But we know that a right to a healthy environment means so much more than access to green space. This forum today continues the public conversation about what it would mean and what it will mean to recognise the right to a healthy environment in the ACT Human Rights Act. It is an important conversation to continue because it's not just an idea now, but something that will become reality imminently. But here's what we've heard so far. Our formal consultation with the community was in July and August this year, and we had a great level of engagement. Our Your Say conversation reached over 550 people, and we received 40 pieces of written feedback, including 22 submissions and 18 survey responses. There was almost unanimous support for recognising the right to a healthy environment, and that is what gave the government so much confidence in being able to express that we will be legislating for it in this term. Participants said that recognising this new right would ensure that the places that we access for work and recreation are safe and accessible and are free from pollution, overdevelopment and other adverse human impacts. We also heard of the importance and value of First Nations knowledge and practices in both how the right is defined and what steps are taken in its implementation. As well as supporting the inclusion of a right to a healthy environment, a strong thread in the conversation has been the need for an accessible complaints mechanism to ensure access to remedies for breaches of this new right, as well as other human rights. This would be, participants told us, an important part of fulfilling the procedural aspects of the right to a healthy environment. Well, this also happened to be very timely feedback, and that's because we had also been actively considering this issue that happened to be the theme of last year's panel, being no rights without remedy. And again, not just considering, but firmly committing. In October, I was able to confirm on behalf of the government that we will be legislating in 2023 to allow the Human Rights Commission to consider human rights complaints. At its core, the right to a healthy environment explicitly recognises the interdependence of people, of communities and the environment in which we live. There has been international consideration of the right to a healthy environment since Stockholm 50 years ago. But perhaps the strongest statement came in July 2022 when the UN General Assembly passed a resolution that recognised the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment as a human right. And a majority of UN member states, including Australia, voted in favour of that resolution. As a government, we now look to these international developments while also considering our own context and the very recent announcement and changes, together with the needs and the expectations of the community and our aspirations for the future. So, the ACT government's next step is to closely and carefully consider the policy issues and the options that our initial consultation brought forward. Working with Minister Vassarotti, I intend to begin leading this work in the first half of 2023. We'll then consult with key stakeholders regarding proposals for the model through which this right will ultimately be realised. And today's discussion from such an impressive panel will be invaluable in shaping my thinking. And I certainly invite you to share the ideas canvassed in and inspired by today's discussion when we begin that work to design the model in the new year. Finally, while not within the theme of today's discussion, but in the context of International Human Rights Day, with your indulgence, I did just want to say two final things. One, to acknowledge the enormous victory that we had for democratic rights last week, with the Restoring Territory Rights Bill finally passing. This has been a fight for more than 25 years, and the fact is, it just shouldn't have been. It should never have happened that way. And I hope history looks back on this period with bewilderment and anger, but also favourably on the many people, including in this room, who didn't let it go, who kept up that fight. And I also want to acknowledge all of those who work so hard in promoting and progressing our human rights framework and human rights agenda here in the ACT. As you've heard, there is a lot going on all at once. By the very nature of our human rights framework, that responsibility falls across our public authorities. But most especially can I thank the team at the Justice and Community Safety Directorate who have advanced our human rights agenda in a very big way this year and done so in a way which is just so thoughtful and so intelligent. Can I also thank most sincerely the Human Rights Commission, the commissioners and all of their staff and teams. This has been a huge year in every respect, and your efforts, your contributions and the way in which you champion rights is just so very valued. We are a better community because of your work every single day, and I thank you most sincerely. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Minister, for your genuine words and your very powerful actions. Really appreciate that, and very proud to call you Australia's first Human Rights Minister. So the rest of today will be a keynote address, live streamed from the USA, and then a panel of our three eminent speakers here. Our keynote address is by Professor John Knox, who's a professor at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. He was the first person appointed as UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment in the period 2012 to 2018. During his mandate, he led and extensively traced the emerging legal recognition of the right to a healthy environment globally, and he collated and summarised core elements of the right in his 2014 mapping exercise and framework principles on human rights and environment. Over to you, Professor Knox. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you, and I'm honored that you asked me to participate in your commemoration of International Human Rights Day. It's exciting to hear how close you are in the ACT to recognition of the human right to a healthy environment. So I'm going to give you a little bit of context, that is to describe the international recognition of the right to a healthy environment. As you just heard from the minister, a great achievement was reached in July of 2022, and I'm going to hopefully explain how we got to that point and maybe say a little bit about what might happen after that. And then I hope to be able to stay on afterwards and listen to your panel and answer any questions that might come up at that point. I think I have ability to control this slideshow from my phone, which seems like a minor miracle, but we'll see if that actually works. So here we go. Yes, amazing. So here's the fundamental starting point, I think. The relationship between human rights and environmental protection is fundamentally an interdependent relationship. That is, a healthy environment is necessary for the enjoyment of a very wide range of human rights, including, of course, rights to life and health. But at the same time, the exercise of human rights, including the rights of freedom of expression and association, rights to information, rights to public participation, and of course, access to justice and effective remedy, the ability to exercise those rights is in turn vital to protecting the environment. This can create a kind of virtuous, I should say, circle. That is, you protect human rights, and as a result, you have better environmental protection, and then in turn, that better environmental protection facilitates protection further of human rights. But of course, the circle can also be a vicious one. If the environment isn't protected, then it can undermine human rights and so forth. Now, how do you reflect this interdependent relationship? There are essentially two pathways that have been chosen to do this. One is, as we're discussing today, recognition of a freestanding, autonomous human right to a healthy environment. But another pathway is to green other human rights, by which I mean applying other human rights to environmental issues. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time describing both of these paths in the international context. So the first one, recognition of the right to a healthy environment. As you may well know, this is a very popular constitutional right around the world. At least 100 countries have recognized the right to a healthy environment in their national constitutions already. Most of these constitutional provisions refer explicitly to health, as in a healthy environment, but there are other formulations as well. About 1/4 refer to some form of ecologically balanced environment, and there are other alternatives such as rights to a clean, safe, favorable, wholesome environment. So we tend to refer to the right to a healthy environment as a kind of shorthand for all of these different variations. But it's important to remember that there are variations, and it's partly why the United Nations chose to include 3 adjectives to capture more of the full range of meanings in the term. At the regional level, many human rights treaties also recognize the right to a healthy environment, again using different kinds of language, starting with the 1981 African Charter of Human and People's Rights, which refers actually to the right of peoples to a satisfactory environment, and then continuing on through the San Salvador Protocol to the American Convention, in Europe, the 1998 Aarhus Convention, and so forth. You see that this is, again, an extremely popular right to be recognized at the regional level. Indeed, virtually every regional human rights system has recognized it. So if you put these together, you see that really a vast majority of countries, over 150 countries, have recognized the right either through this regional treaty form or through national constitutions. Now, you see some major exceptions, including, of course, Australia, the United States, Canada. It has been pointed out that there seems to be kind of a block of, let's say, Anglo-American jurisprudence countries, that is, countries that seem to share in common a common law approach to the treatment of rights, that have been reluctant to accept this right. Now, at the international level, of course, the fundamental foundational text is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the General Assembly in 1948. Coming as it did 20 years before the rise of the modern environmental movement, the Universal Declaration does not refer to the right to a healthy environment, but Shortly after the modern environmental movement began, at the very first International Environmental Conference in Stockholm in 1972, again, as you just heard reference to, there's a fairly clear, or at least close to a clear statement of the right. In the 1972 Stockholm Declaration, it refers to the fundamental right to freedom, equality, and adequate conditions of life in an environment of equality that permits a life of dignity and well-being. That may not be the most elegant way of referring to the right, but it's definitely a very strong step in the right direction. Unfortunately, it took the United Nations 50 years to take the next step and complete that commitment. 20 years later, in the Rio Declaration, was actually a step backwards. Here you have a kind of weak paraphrase of the right to a healthy environment. That is the idea that human beings are entitled to a healthy and productive life in harmony with nature. Entitled to may, in some ways, sound like a synonym for having a right to, but of course it doesn't really mean the same thing at all. At the United Nations Human Rights Commission, also in the early 90s, there was a very serious attempt to try and convince the United Nations to recognize the right, led by a group of experts at the United Nations, which drafted a declaration on human rights and the environment, led by a special rapporteur of the subcommission, Fatima Centini. However, the Human Rights Commission, the intergovernmental body that at the time was the main United Nations human rights body, rejected the proposal. And so it sat for a very long time, blocked at the United Nations from recognition, and without, therefore, any kind of global overarching human right to a healthy environment. In the absence of such a right, however, internationally, human rights bodies continued to build a very strong and detailed environmental human rights jurisprudence. And again, they did so through the second path I identified, that is by greening human rights. These pictures include the European Court of Human Rights in the upper left hand, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in the lower left hand, and special rapporteurs and treaty bodies on the right. These are, these vary in their ability to issue binding decisions in their coverage. They vary in the rights that they interpret. But what they have in common is that they began increasingly to hear cases involving environmental harm, and they increasingly began to accept the arguments made by advocates that environmental harm both interfered with the exercise and enjoyment of human rights, and that therefore states had obligations to protect the human rights against the environmental harm. And again, this was against the backdrop of a very wide range of instruments and a very wide range of human rights, including rights to life, rights to health, rights of non-discrimination, very much including rights of indigenous peoples, especially in the inter-American context, and other rights as well. Sorry, my clicker has momentarily abandoned me here. Let's see if it's found me again. Here we go. So after about 20 years or so of this burgeoning environmental human rights jurisprudence, the intergovernmental human rights body at the United Nations, which by now had become the Human Rights Council, replacing the Human Rights Commission, the Human Rights Council returned to this issue. The Human Rights Council, as you may know, is composed of governments that meet 3 times a year. They adopt resolutions. Frankly, they're often reluctant to criticize each other very harshly, but they do have this ability to appoint special rapporteurs that, for the most part, are designed or requested to review and monitor and try to promote compliance with existing human rights. So, for example, there are special rapporteurs on torture and the right to food and a very wide variety of existing rights. But occasionally they appoint an independent expert to try and clarify the relationship between human rights or some other area. So, for example, they had done so with human rights in business about 8 years before this. So in 2012, the Human Rights Council decided for the first time that it was time to clarify the relationship at the United Nations level between human rights and the environment. And they created a new mandate and asked the independent expert, which I had the honor of being appointed to take the position of, a few months later, to study the human rights obligations relating to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment and identify best practices in the use. So I spent 3 years holding a series of consultations around the world with the help of a lot of people, issuing a series of mapping reports that I summed up in one March 2014 report to the United Nations as saying, here's what human rights bodies around the world have said about the relationship of human rights and the environment. Specifically, that states have 3 types of obligations. They have obligations that can be identified as procedural obligations, which include to provide environmental information, facilitate public participation in environmental decision-making, and to provide for remedies. They also have substantive obligations to adopt and implement environmental standards and to enforce them, very much including against corporations. And third, they have a set of obligations having to do with non-discrimination and protection of those who are most at risk from environmental harm. After the first 3-year term of my mandate, the Human Rights Council decided essentially, okay, these obligations seem clear enough that we can now ask you to become a special rapporteur, like the other special rapporteurs, and try and actually promote compliance with these obligations, which I did for the next 3 years. At the end of which, and I won't go into all the detail about what I did or what my successor, David Boyd, has done since then, but I will say in 2018, in my final report to the Human Rights Council, I tried to summarize everything that human rights bodies had said, everything that human rights law had developed with respect to the environment, and what I called framework principles on human rights and the environment. And these framework principles spelled out in more detail these procedural obligations, which included, again, the obligations that I've already mentioned, including protection of environmental defenders in particular. I tried to spell out more detail what human rights bodies had said about substantive obligations. Authorities have somewhat more discretion to set environmental standards at levels that are appropriate for that society. No one expects Madagascar to have exactly the same environmental standards as Denmark, for example. However, there are some common factors that should be taken into account, including that the standards should be non-discriminatory, non-regressive, and they should be effectively enforced. And I referred to the importance of international cooperation and tried to spell out how that would look with respect to issues like climate change and the global loss of biodiversity. And of course, I said more about the obligation of states not to discriminate and their obligations to protect the most vulnerable. I went into quite a bit of detail, drawing on existing international human rights standards, of course, about the rights of Indigenous peoples in particular. So that's where things stood in 2018. The Human Rights Council renewed the mandate. My term was up, but they appointed a Canadian law professor named David Boyd and asked him to continue to report to the council, but also to begin to report to the General Assembly. In my final report, was actually to the General Assembly combined with David's first report for reasons I won't get into having to do with UN kind of procedures. We essentially issued a joint report together, which David presented to the General Assembly in the fall of 2018. That report called on the United Nations finally to recognize the human right to a healthy environment. Essentially, we said, the time has come. It is clear now what environmental human rights law looks like. It's clear what the norms are. Most states around the world have already recognized this. It's time for the United Nations to join. We looked at the standards that the United Nations had set previously for recognition of new human rights, and we made the case that this new human right clearly met those standards. And I won't go into detail here just in the interest of time, but I'll just note that the last standard that the United Nations had said is important is the attraction of broad international support. There is no right since the 1948 Universal Declaration that has attracted more international support than the right to a healthy environment. And I mean that literally. There is no right that's more popular since 1948, no new right that's more popular than the right to a healthy environment. So we said not only is the time come because states have recognized it at the national and international level already, but that the time has come because of the environmental crisis and the way in which recognition of a human right to a healthy environment actually strengthens environmental performance. Where states have adopted this right at the national level, it has improved their environmental performance in concrete ways. Now, we said there's various ways of recognizing the right. You could do it through a new treaty or a protocol to existing treaty, But by far the easiest and fastest way to do it would be through adoption of a new United Nations declaration or resolution. That resolution happened. I would love to go into more detail about what happened in the 3 years to make it possible. Let me just say that a lot of people worked very hard to get to that point. Over 1,000 civil society organizations joined in a coalition to sign a letter to support it. Many governments took very strong pro positions, including Costa Rica in particular, which kind of led the charge at the United Nations. David Boyd made it the centerpiece of his work, to his great credit, and many others supported it as well. It culminated at the Human Rights Council in October of 2021. It's so hard for me to believe that was just over a year ago, when Ambassador Catalina de Vandas Aguilar of Costa Rica introduced the resolution, whose first operative paragraph said simply, the Human Rights Council recognizes the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right. That right was approved by the Human Rights Council by an overwhelming vote of 43-0 with only 4 abstentions. However, there were quite a few states that seemed reluctant, or at least were not enthusiastic about this, including Australia and the United States. So we had our work cut out for us to go to the next step, which was to commence the United Nations General Assembly to recognize the right. That is the traditional forum in the United Nations for recognizing new human rights, going all the way, again, back to 1948. These are some of the people who celebrated. I hope you see by the happy looks on our face that we're in a celebratory mood. This is a picture we took after recognition of the right on July 28th. These include representatives of Costa Rica, Maldives, Morocco, Slovenia, and Switzerland, the core group of governments that pushed it, as well as David Boyd standing on my right and myself. It was a very happy day. The resolution itself is quite straightforward. Again, it simply recognized the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right. It includes some other provisions, essentially affirming its connection to other human rights and to multinational environmental agreements. And it calls on states, international organizations, business enterprises, and other relevant stakeholders to implement the right in general terms. To be clear about this resolution is not, of course, binding. It's meant to be aspirational and catalytic, to lead states and other actors to do more to implement the right where they've already recognized it and to recognize the right where they have not. I am very happy to say that it was adopted by a truly overwhelming vote of 161-0. Again, because of the efforts of a really vast number of people, states that had been on the fence, including Australia and the United States, voted for it. All I can say is that's a real achievement. It's unfortunate that it took 50 years. I'll kind of echo the words of the environmental minister who said it's kind of, with respect to the law you were just talking about territorial rights, future generations will look back and say, how on earth did this take so long? But hopefully they will also appreciate the efforts of the people who finally were able to achieve it. That's really all I have to say about this. I'm except to just to note that, as a small measure of the interest in this, I'm on Twitter. Most of my tweets about human rights and the environment might be retweeted, I don't know, a few dozen or a few hundred times. This was retweeted thousands and thousands of times. It was seen by close to 1 million people. Not because of my great eloquence in just saying the General Assembly has adopted this, but because people around the world are in crying need and utter support for this right. There's a huge desire to try and bring human rights and the environment together. So again, congratulations on moving forward in your own way, and I just want to give you the best wishes as you go forward. And I'll stay online if I can and listen to the panel talk about next steps. Thank you again very much.
Thank you so much, John. That was such an authoritative and comprehensive introduction as a keynote that we can now discuss as a panel. As you said, I think the time has come for the ACT to lead the way as the first jurisdiction to enshrine the right to a healthy environment in law. So our three distinguished panellists are Mary Mudford, who did our Welcome to Country. She's a Ngunnawal woman and manager of the Traditional Custodian Engagement and the ACT's Environment Planning and Sustainable Development Directorate. Her important work has been central ensuring that the voice, insight and knowledge of traditional owners are forefront in the activities and development of Ngunnawal country, and particularly the Namarak project at Denman Prospect on the Molonglo River is very important. Dr Sophie Lewis is the ACT Commissioner for Sustainability and the Environment, and she was the 2019 ACT Scientist of the Year. She's an experienced climate scientist who contributed to the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, which informs global responses and has extensive links to Australian universities. Melanie Montalban is the managing lawyer of the ACT practice of the Environmental Defenders Office. She was the lead author of the recent influential report, A Healthy Environment is a Human Right, which was only released in October this year. And you may be aware that it was the EDO that represented youth verdict in the Waratah coal case. I've got a couple of questions I'll ask each panellist, and then people can just feel free to jump in, including John. But firstly, I want to ask Mary, how do you think we can ensure that Indigenous notions of a healthy country are first and foremost when we think about the right to a healthy environment?
So for me as a Ngunnawal woman in particular, the right to a healthy environment is critically important to not only myself but my community. We are a people of the land. We were born from country. We were the first land managers of this country. We were the first people who walked this country, the first people to speak on this country. And it's really important to us that our environment provides an opportunity for us to continue our cultural practices. Our cultural practices, our ceremonies, our law are all related to a healthy environment. And therefore, a healthy environment for us needs to be a healthy environment. We're seeing through climate change at the moment the changes in our environment, and my community are majorly concerned around the flora and fauna on Ngunnawal country and what is going to happen to those, because a lot of our practices are related to our flora and fauna. For example, the collection of coolamans from trees, the collection of reeds for basket weaving. There are so many practices that are associated to country through our flora and fauna. And for us to continue to practice and celebrate our culture on this land, we need a healthy environment. It's critically important for all people to have a healthy environment because it's important to us. We recognise as Ngunnawal people that we have a responsibility for sharing our country and our culture with those that live in the ACT. And it's important that they are able to have the opportunity to walk on our country and benefit from the health and well-being that walking on country brings us. And I think it's something that has been lacking in understanding of our people and our rights as right holders, not stakeholders, in the management of country. It's really important that our rights as the Ngunnawal people are respected and valued, and that our voice is extremely strong and loud in the management of country. Because for us, if our rights were taken away from us throughout colonisation, our right to be able to celebrate and practice culture on country was taken away from us for such a long time, and we're trying to re-establish that now, in the here and now, a practice that has been going on for many years. Many Ngunnawal voices have been begging for the right to be able to celebrate our culture, acknowledge our culture and have rights on this country. And I do acknowledge that those rights are starting to be recognised, but we still have a long journey to walk together to achieve that.
Mary, what do you think meaningful consultation with the Ngunnawal people look like?
So for me, meaningful consultation is not just consulting with us, hearing our voice and walking away and developing something on your own. Meaningful consultation for me is actually meaningful engagement. It's actually about engagement of my people, throughout the whole process of the development of whatever it may be. Co-design is critically important to us. Helen spoke about a prime example of what our voice can achieve when we work together in partnership, in a true, genuine partnership, and that's Numerag. So Numerag is a special purpose reserve that was being developed in the Denman Prospect precinct, and the first time I was taken out there for a meeting, I was with Michaela Jade, a fellow First Nations employee of EPSDD, and there were a number of male rangers and other staff from major projects, etc. And they were all having this wonderful conversation about infrastructure and what's going here and how things should work. And then Michaela spoke up and she said, "Whoa, guys, hang on a minute. You have a First Nations Ngunnawal community member here, and her voice needs to be heard before anybody else's." And they stopped and they all turned around and looked at me, and I looked at them and I went, "No infrastructure. This site is so significant to my people because of the relationship to the Molonglo River, and also the Molonglo River being a critical pathway for us into the mountains for ceremony with other First Nations groups from around our country." And they all sort of went, yeah, okay. And I was like, are they hearing me? So I continued the conversation and explained a little bit more what I meant about not having infrastructure. We have so much infrastructure in the ACT already with parks and other reserves, and I think it's important to celebrate and keep a natural environment where we can. So I explained this. We all left the site. When I got the minutes from that meeting, most of the words that I had spoken about were not recorded in those notes. And I was deeply disheartened and disappointed because for the first time, well, not really the first time, but for the first time in my work life here in the ACT, I felt that my voice was not being heard. And I wasn't sure if that was because I was a woman or whether it was because I was a Ngunnawal woman, or whether it was just not what they were used to. So in the end, I went and had a conversation with our PCS projects manager, and that conversation resulted in me meeting with the rest of her team and providing them with an education about why it's important that Ngunnawal people be part of the conversation. And from that point, we started to develop a stronger relationship and understanding between us. So that responsibility is not just Ngunnawal people's responsibility to have their voice heard. It is about everybody in this room having an understanding that if you require engagement with our Ngunnawal community, it is also your responsibility to participate and support us to have our voice heard and to be able to have the opportunities to speak our truth of country.
Thanks, Mary. That's a great example. And I know the Sustainable Environment Network, you talked about how they brought soil in so as not to disturb the artefacts. That was really important.
Yeah. So for us, that area, we've identified that being part of the pathway for our people, that there were campsites along that location, and that particular location was one of those campsites. So we know that there are artefacts there. And so one of the methodologies that the project team had envisioned using for regeneration of that site was to scrape. So scraping takes the top 10 centimetres or so of soil off to enable regeneration of native plants. At one of our site visits, this methodology was being spoken about, and soon as the word scraping was brought into the conversation, a community member stepped up and said, "No, you are not scraping this site." And the project team sort of stopped and almost took a step back and the community members said the reason why you cannot squat on this site is because there are artefacts under this surface that need to remain in situ. For us as a people, when we have artefacts or objects in the ground, they need to remain where they are because that is their home, that is where they belong, and removing them is detrimental to us as a people and to our country and our values. So Darren LaRue, who was the project manager for that particular site, stepped up and he said, I'm happy to change the methodology, and made a couple of suggestions, and one of those was bringing soil in from the John Gorton. I never get that drive right because I don't use it. So bringing soil in from that had been removed to cover the site, and the community were overjoyed that scraping didn't happen in that location because, as I've said, those artefacts need to remain in situ as part of our cultural values.
Thanks so much. Sophie, do you think, what are the main environmental challenges facing the ACT at the moment?
Well,
it's a very big question, I know.
I can cover it in two, and particularly because Mary and Minister Cheyne have really kind of laid the groundwork for me making everyone feel even more dreadful. So clearly the first thing I'm going to talk about is climate change. Earlier this year, the IPCC released their 6th assessment report, so their 6th time reviewing the latest science on how our climate system is changing and what that might look like for the future. When the first part of that report was published, that was described as a code red for humanity because of the significance of the findings. And when the third part of the report was published some 6 months later, that was reported as a catalogue of human suffering because of the findings within those reports. And we know that climate change is an issue of global significance that will affect everyone today and for decades to come, and that includes here in the ACT. And we know that because in 2019, the ACT declared a climate emergency in recognition of that picture, and because for those of us who were living in Eastern Australia during the Black Summer bushfires, we firsthand experienced some of the outcomes of climate change on the human realm and on our natural world. Within the ACT, we know that we have physical vulnerabilities to climate change. We know it's already impacting our waterways, our rainfall patterns, our temperatures, our temperature extremes, but we also know that it's already impacting us as people. We know that the impact of climate change is not evenly distributed across countries and within cities. So even here within the ACT, we know that those who are already most deeply impacted by climate change are people who have least capacity to be resilient because of their health vulnerabilities, because of their economic status. So that is a challenge for the ACT, and that will not change if I were sitting on this panel in 1 year's time or 10 years' time. That is something that we have to be looking at addressing. And the other major challenge was, again, what Mary discussed in terms of recognising those threats to our plants and animals, and what Minister Cheyne was talking about in terms of the impact on our biodiversity. So earlier this year, that very belated federal State of the Environment report was released, and that painted a picture of very poor environmental health across Australia, but also that the trend for our environment was deteriorating. And those assessments were really around the loss of biodiversity and the impact of human activities, not just through climate change, but through things like land development, invasive species, on our ecosystems, and the increase in the number of threatened species. While the ACT State of the Environment report, the last one being in 2019, is not quite as dire, those threats to our biodiversity and really that kind of structure or that integrity of our nature are not something that we're protected from here in the ACT. We know that our lifestyles here have a great impact on the environment. Our ecological footprint is 9 times the size of the territory. So by that, I mean that if everybody across the world lived like Canberrans, would need 9 planet Earths. So we have a huge impact on the environment here in the territory, and as our city expands, we know that we're pushing into those areas of enormous conservation value, and we're impinging on the quality of those ecosystems. So I think that probably sums up two tremendous challenges for us.
Absolutely. And do you think having the Human Rights Act recognise the right to a healthy environment will help us address those 2 issues long term?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's because of how profoundly important having that right to a healthy environment is in recognising the intrinsic linkages between people and the environment. So we have these key environmental determinants of our own human health in terms of the quality of our air, our water, our environment, but also that requires more than just a small pieces of the environment. So rather than looking at what is already included in our environmental protections or our preservation of mature native trees. So rather than having small parts of the environment that we're protecting, it's looking at the health of the environment as a whole. So in making that recognition, I think we're moving far towards addressing the big challenges that can't be addressed through small pieces of change or small policies over time. But also I think it was so wonderful to have this keynote that laid out that legislative framework for us, because then we can start to see, well, I love the environment. A healthy environment sounds great, but what does that actually mean? Having that wonderful keynote where we can see in jurisdictions where the right to a healthy environment has been enshrined, we see an improvement in environmental performance, we see better environmental outcomes, but we also see better outcomes for people who are in those at-risk groups, including older people, younger people, people who have specific medical needs. So there's the significance of this right in terms of who we want to be as Canberrans, that we value our environment, that we're very proud of our 100% renewable targets and being so on the forefront of recognising the climate emergency. But then in terms of the tangible nature of what that means is that does lead to better environmental outcomes, and where we have better environmental outcomes, we have better outcomes for people.
Thank you so much. Just one further question. Do you think that what the local impact will be, do you think that's going to have a broader impact, given it's mainly federal regulation and state regulation, given that we're so small?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And I get this question a lot about the territory being very small. And I think there's a few ways that I could answer that, but I think we saw earlier this year that the idea that a jurisdiction being small means that they can obfuscate from responsibility or action is not something that the community accepts. I think we saw at the federal election that saying that we're small emitters or we're not having a big impact is not what the community expects in terms of commitment and ambition. So you mentioned my work on the IPCC. So there's a term that's used for countries that make very small progress in terms of their commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that's free riders. So they're countries that rely on others to do the hard work. So I think there's that, but there is also something that we've seen happen time and time again where one jurisdiction makes a big step forward and that emboldens others to follow, and I think that's a place that Canberra can fill very naturally, because I think we have a willingness to make those steps, and I think that encourages other jurisdictions to do so.
I'm hope in Queensland and Victoria, since they have human rights legislation anyway. Thank you so much. Melanie, how do you think framing the right to a healthy environment as a human rights impact on government's decision making and actions?
Thanks for the question, Helen. Firstly, it would depend on how the right to a healthy environment is defined in our Human Rights Act, but if it is broad in scope and comprehensive and is consistent with international law and in particular the UN General Assembly resolution, then what it should do is fill in the gaps that environmental and human rights law currently are inadequate to address our climate change and biodiversity crises. Dr Lewis has outlined the key environmental challenges in the ACT, which demonstrates that our environmental laws are failing us currently. Environmental laws also segment out or carve out components of the environment. So we have laws that regulate water, climate change, biodiversity, Aboriginal cultural heritage, whereas the right to a healthy environment really considers the environment as a whole. In terms of human rights law, the environment has ancillary protections through other rights that are protected, like the right to life and the right to privacy. And we've seen that those rights are important in protecting the environment, particularly with the recent Waratah coal decision. But a standalone right really will better protect the environment or connect human rights to the environment as a standalone issue. In terms of how it'll impact government decision making, so under the Human Rights Act, public authorities, which includes ministers, government agencies and public servants, it requires them to act consistently with and consider human rights in making their decisions. So if the right to a healthy environment is recognised, that will also form part of their actions and decisions. If a person thinks that a public authority has failed to do so, they have an option to seek or initiate proceedings in the Supreme Court, which can order any relief that the court thinks is reasonable except for damages. But even prior to that, what is important about having the right to a healthy environment in the Human Rights Act is that it would require the Legislative Assembly and government departments to consider the environmental impacts at an early and routine stage in developing laws. And so that's our dialogue model, and I think it's really important to have those conversations early. I do not suggest that we should be incorporating the right to a healthy environment to seek legal action in court. I think that should be a last resort, and I think we should be having these conversations a lot earlier. I think I should also just note that currently under the Human Rights Act, private entities, including businesses, as I understand it, can opt in to have the same obligations as public authorities. I have recommended that private entities should be bound by the same obligations as public authorities because, to be honest, it's usually businesses that are actually are the biggest polluters, really, so they should also be held accountable. Thanks.
Thanks. For the audience here and the audience online, what do you think the difference will be for them and their families? I guess as humans, I think that we intrinsically understand that a healthy environment is good for us. It's good for our health, I think, or at least, personally, when I'm not feeling well, what I want to do is go forest bathing. I want to go for a walk in nature. I want to go for hikes, camping, go to the coast, swim the ocean, sunbake by it. And so a healthy environment is a major underlying determinant of our health and well-being. And I would expect that the greatest benefit of the right to a healthy environment being enshrined in law is that it results in healthier people and ecosystems. And there have been studies conducted in countries that do recognise the right, which have shown that there's increased environmental indicators like cleaner air, cleaner water, reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that would be a benefit for Territorians here. Absolutely. And what do you think about having a complaint mechanism that's accessible in terms of the remedy that is required under UN principles?
Yes, so a procedural element of the right to a healthy environment is access to justice and effective remedies. I very much welcome the government's announcement that it will introduce a accessible complaints mechanism into the Human Rights Act or other piece of legislation which would allow the Commission to conciliate complaints. Although I understand the government has committed in principle to allowing the transfer of complaints to the ACT Civil and Administrative Tribunal if conciliation is unsuccessful, I would still be advocating for that to also be included in this reform. Why that's really important is because currently under the Human Rights Act, as I mentioned, if a person thinks that their human rights has been breached, they can initiate proceedings in the Supreme Court, but that is not by any means an accessible route for everyday Toratorians. It is complicated. You normally require a lawyer. It is lengthy. You expose yourself to adverse costs orders. And so having an accessible complaints mechanism is a great alternative that's timely and cost effective.
And would a good example of that be the Sharma case in the federal court?
Yes, perfect example.
And the Rio Tinto action in WA, another one?
Yes, I think if there had been a human rights option, that could have been resolved at a much earlier stage and with a better outcome for the people involved.
Thanks so much, Melanie. One for you, John, if you don't mind joining in virtually. What do you think will be the difference in having it framed as an actual human right, the right to a healthy environment?
So, I mean, I think it is important to realize, of course, that this greening human rights process has already created, you might think of as kind of an overlapping, interlocking network of human rights in the environment, environmental human rights law already. So it's a very reasonable question to ask, well, what more does recognition of the human right to a healthy environment add? I mean, I think you've already heard from some of your speakers, including Melanie just now, of some of the things it adds. Let me just kind of maybe crystallize those into just two major kind of aspects. One is there are gaps in that overlapping, interlocking network. In particular, right now, under the greening human rights approach, where you have to rely on the right to life or the right to health or some other right to make your environmental argument, you have to show a kind of causal link between the environmental harm and the interference with the existing human right. That sometimes is easy to show, sometimes is quite difficult to show, but recognizing the right to a healthy environment as a standalone right means that human rights law has essentially codified the idea that we have a right to the environment itself being healthy, not just that we have the right to our own health not being too adversely affected by environmental harm, which again may in specific cases be hard to show and to the level that courts, for example, would like to see. So one important element of this is simply that it pulls together and closes gaps in this existing network of law. A second one, which I think is in some ways easy to overlook or denigrate, but I actually think is extremely important, is that it indicates in a very clear, straightforward way how important environmental protection is to our health, to our human health and well-being, to our cultural practices, especially of indigenous peoples, to our existence on this planet, in a way that it's difficult to capture in the same way in any other way. I mean, I've given lots of talks about the relationship between human rights and the environment. I can explain in some detail how all of these other human rights are affected by environmental harm. It takes me a while to do that. People understand much more quickly, easily, and simply what it means to say there's a human right to a healthy environment that you have, and so does every other human being on this planet. Now, you still have to have the discussion about what exactly that entails, but the basic idea is one that's very easy to express and to capture. And you simply can't get there any other way than through recognition of the human right to a healthy environment. In other words, it has enormously powerful catalytic and inspirational value, which I think it's really important not to underestimate.
And I think that intergenerational aspect as well, it's not just our health now, it's for future generations who are even unborn. Back to Mary, are there any additional environmental or practical challenges that have particular significance for Ngunnawal people in the broader Aboriginal community?
There have been many since colonisation. I just wanted to, as John was talking, I just was reflecting, and I think one of the important things that we as human beings sometimes forget is that we expect to have rights of our environment and we take from the environment. For me as a Ngunnawal person and for my community and for other First Nations people, we do not see the land and the waters as a commodity. We see them as life givers. And for us, that needs to be part and parcel of how we move forward into the future. Because if we don't recognise that we have to stop taking from our environment and start working within the environment, things are not going to change with climate change or improving the health of our environment. And I think that is going to be a hard conversation for some people to value and understand, particularly those in our community who don't engage in the environment, don't engage with First Nations people, don't engage with government or value their input. And I think that is one of our biggest hurdles. And the right to speak for country is something that is often associated just with any First Nations person. And I think it's time for governments to start recognising that we are not just Aboriginal people, we are not just Indigenous, we have our own individual identities, we have our own law and practices around country that need to be recognised and respected. So the right for Ngunnawal people, being the traditional custodians of this country, need to come before any other voices. We need to be the starting point. And I also believe that we also need to start recognising that the practices that we did for land management for thousands of years need to start being valued and integrated back into our environment.
Do you think the Black Summer of 2019-20 was opened people's eyes up to that?
In some respects, yes. It's in some areas, particularly within New South Wales along the coast, I'll reflect back a little bit further than that. The Tathra fires, where Tathra was basically wiped out, and from that, cultural burning became very, very prominent in that location. And those residents involved in that started talking to other communities and identifying the benefits of cultural burning within their landscape. So along the south coast, there were a lot of reports after the fires from property owners who had engaged in cultural burning activities with the local Yuin mob down there, that their properties were actually saved because of those cultural burns. Another issue, if I can just go back, just reflecting on that, is that a lot of current legislation in the ACT precludes my right, my community's right as Ngunnawal people to undertake practices within the environment. We recently have been going through a process of consultations. It's called the King Brown Ngunnawal project, and it's called King Brown in honour of Uncle Carl Brown, who was very prominent in fighting for Ngunnawal rights on this country and for the protection of culture and heritage, but also re-implementation of cultural burning within the landscape. And the voices that we're hearing through those consultations are saying red tape is community's issue. Government red tape is community's issue, the biggest issue that we have. we had a community man stand up and say, I walk on country nearly every day. I walk on country with my children, with my grandchildren. And he said, I'd be walking along and I recognise that the space that I'm currently in needs a burn, and now is the right time to do it. And if I could, I would just undertake that burn right there and right then. But if I do that, I could be charged for it. So it's recognising that there are ways that we can work together to support each other to create environmental change.
Thanks, Mary. We're just going to have Q&A from the audience. Have we got some spare mics? We've got Chris there in the second row. Thank you.
Thanks, that was awesome. My question is around tobacco smoking or at least tobacco smoke impacting people in relation to human rights. We have increasing densification of housing in the ACT, and with increased costs, people really have no choice but to live in dense housing now. But when people are impacted by tobacco smoke from their neighbours, there are very few rights to actually tackle that. Will this right be applicable to tobacco smoke?
I guess it depends on how you define environment. It changes in different jurisdictions. So, as I understand it here in the ACT, the environment includes the built environment. I think that it would encompass, I'm not entirely sure, I haven't thought of tobacco smoke in particular, but I feel like that's impacting a range of other rights that could include the right to a healthy environment, like the right to housing, the right to health. But yeah, the right to a healthy environment might be broad enough to incorporate that, but I haven't thought about it enough.
We've got a question in the third row and then to the front row. Thank you.
I wonder how many people realize that Walter Burley Griffin actually designed this capital as a healthy capital, decentralized. He actually said, I want the children in cities to be as healthy as those in the country. But my question also is about the application of the new healthy environment. A lot of people talk about a healthy environment as a non-polluted environment, but the UN report actually mentions perhaps the greatest dangers to the world's cities is the urban heat island effect. Now, what is happening in this city, especially in the old suburbs, is that builders buy up a lot of plots of small houses and big gardens and then cover it with concrete for apartments, townhouses, where a lot of people will have air conditioners blasting out hot air, so that it can easily happen that the neighbors will now have a 10-degree hotter environment than before. And of course, the CSIRO report of 2017, which unfortunately hasn't been revived, already recognized this, that parts of Canberra are 10 degrees hotter than the mean temperature. Now, as long as we have La Nina, which is cool, it's okay. But once we're back to 40 degrees, these areas will have 50 degrees, which is fatal to most, especially small children and the elderly. Will a person who's experiencing this from their new neighbors have the right to go to the Human Rights Commission and say, well, this is no longer a healthy environment, 50 degrees?
I think it would be the decisions in terms of planning would need to anticipate that. So the impact we see is the change in government decision making. So every cabinet decision will have to have the idea of what the impact will be on the environment as, you know, an actual human right. So I think there will be some assessment of that. It's whether the limits are reasonable. Sophie?
Yeah, I think that comes in beautifully with what Melanie was saying, that having the right to a healthy environment would create that thinking so early in the planning around legislation and policies for the territory. So rather than the kind of disconnect between the block level where a house goes and infrastructure around that creates these environments where we have huge urban heat islands and huge disparities in terms of the environment that children are living in between suburbs and creating those inequities, we would be forced to be thinking about, well, what does climate adaptation and resilience look like across all of those relevant policies and legislations so that we avoid that becoming an issue in the first place.
And if I could just add also the Darra Ngunnawal Caring for Country Committee, which is a collective of Ngunnawal people working with the Environment Planning and Sustainable Development Directorate, have been engaged in conversations around the Planning Act review. And one of the comments that have come out of their conversations is that native plants need to be restored back into the environment as opposed to non-native plants, because reintroducing those native plants restores plants who belong in this environment and can survive in this environment. But also as part of that, they're also wanting an understanding of how climate change is also impacting our native plants as well, because it's critically important to us that our native plants are supported within the ACT landscape as well.
Thanks, Mary. We'll just go to Hannah in the front row, and then we've got 2 more questions. I think that's about all we can fit in.
Yeah, thanks very much. The questions concern the planning reforms, and each question has addressed those. This is a 1 in 20 year project to reform the planning legislation. My question is the ACT government being proactive in looking at the benchmarks that the right to a safe and healthy human environment might establish in terms of living conditions and impacts on local environments, given that this right has been around and recognised since 1972 in the Stockholm Declaration? It seems a shame that if the large-scale planning reform proceeds apace and the consultations on the right doesn't start till 23, it might be a lost opportunity. And there needs to be that thinking done to see how the right is going to impact and then how to reform the planning system so that issues of density and quality of fresh air and so on aren't negatively impacted by poor planning.
So the way I'd see benchmarks would be in the State of the Environment Report 2023 is the next one. Is that right, Sophie? And and also the wellbeing framework, because all cabinet decisions and all budget decisions are now in the wellbeing framework. So there are benchmarks there. So I think those 2 things would be one way of...
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think... Oh, sorry, Melanie, you were... I think, you know, every time that a consultation opens, I think, oh, geez, I wish this one had come before that one, and that, you know, if this could be on my, you know, ideal trajectory of progression and progress. But I don't disagree that this is an invaluable opportunity, the planning system review and reform, but I don't think we're lacking in the information we need to be valuing the environment more in our consideration of the territory. So while that might not be the preferred order for having everything we need, we certainly have enough information about what we need for a healthy environment for the territory now.
I just wanted to add that EDO has been proactive in this regard, and our submission to the planning inquiry actually reviewed the planning bill to the extent that it is consistent with the right to a healthy environment, and we've provided multiple recommendations to the ACT government and how it should be amended to be consistent with the right to a healthy environment. And I'm hoping our outstanding 33 recommendations are incorporated.
I think we had another question here.
I'm just interested in how the concept of environmental personhood kind of intersects with this conversation, and kind of following on from what you were saying, Mary, around how we actually consider our environment and our relationship with it. And I'm not saying that recognition within the colonial legal system is going to where kind of First Nations understandings of these environmental aspects, but I'm just curious about your thoughts on what that might mean for the protection of rivers and other environmental systems, and also, John, if there's any, given that there's some international examples, if you've got any thoughts on that. Do you want to ask yours as well?
Do you want to answer that and then I'll ask?
Do it quickly because there's no more time after you two.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Jay. My question goes to a issue that was raised during the Keynote presentation that I hadn't thought much about before, and that's the right to a healthy environment having a pillar that regards, say, environmental defenders and people's right to fight to protect the environment. In New South Wales, we've recently seen a case where someone has been convicted with, I think, 15 months in prison with 9 months non-parole, and increasing crackdown on environmental and climate protesters across the country. It's less of an immediate issue in the ACT, but nonetheless I wanted to know if there are any international examples of the right to environment intersecting with environmental defender legislation and cases, and also if that has been considered as part of the conversation in the ACT.
Sure. Mary, do you want to take the first, and then John and Melanie for the second, and then we'll hand over to the Minister? It's
Quite a big question you've asked there, and there's no real easy answer because, you know, we see ourselves as superior, and we as people need to recognise that all of us need to coexist within the environment together. And I think that's one of the key principles that people need to focus on, is that we need to coexist within the environment. Over to you, John.
Okay, thank you. So if I can just say a word on the first question, I don't think that there's anything at all inconsistent between the right to a healthy environment and rights of nature. In fact, I think they're very consistent, and increasingly I expect that more and more we'll see the right to a healthy environment as protecting natural ecosystems or elements of natural ecosystems, in large part because of their intrinsic value. I think, I'm not obviously going to speak on behalf of Indigenous peoples. You have a very eloquent speaker who can do that much better than I can. I will just say that around the world, this is a common thread through, let's say, the contrast between largely Western ways of thinking about the environment as Mary said, as kind of commodities or resources, and Indigenous ways of thinking about the environment. And I think it's important to realize that the human right to a healthy environment is not set in stone in this way. It's informed by how we interpret it, and it's important to include in that interpretation evaluation of the environment as Mary said, life-giving, and not simply as a way of saying that the environment is valuable only insofar as it's valuable to us for you know, the ways we can use it. I don't know if I'm being very eloquent about that at all. It's 9:30 at night here in the United States, so I'm maybe getting a little unclear about that. But in any event, the second question, I'm sorry, can you remind me what the second question was again?
Environmental
I
defenders.
thought I had it clear in my mind, but.
Yep. It was about environmental defenders.
Oh yeah, of course, thank you. Right, I'm very glad you asked that question. So I actually had some slides on this, which I didn't show in the interest of time, but just so we're all aware of this, and maybe you are all already aware of it, environmental defenders are the most at-risk human rights defenders globally. About 2/3 of all human rights defenders that are killed every year are killed because of their work on environmental and land. A very disproportionately high number of those are from Indigenous peoples. Killings are the kind of the tip of the iceberg in this. As you're suggesting, environmental defenders are at risk in all kinds of ways. They're harassed, they're detained, they're arrested and convicted for lengthy, disproportionate sentences. And that's true in every country I visited as a special rapporteur. Whatever else we were talking about in those countries, whatever else the meetings were about, it always came up that environmental defenders were being harassed, suffered violence, and in many countries, again, were killed on an average of 2 a week around the world. So I would say very much the recognition of the right to a healthy environment needs to be accompanied by a recognition of the need to protect those who are on the front line of environmental protection. I would say in many ways, this is the single most overlooked global environmental crisis. That is the crisis of protecting the people who are on the front lines of environmental protection. And the example you gave is a good example of that. People receiving disproportionate sentences for peaceful protests is very much a problem in countries all around the world, including countries that think that they have a very strong record on freedom of expression or protecting peaceful association. Often environmental defenders are treated differently and worse. And so I would very strongly encourage the ACT to take that on. Again, not just because you think it's worth protecting for the ACT, although it is, but also because what you do here, I hope, will be a model, as you've already suggested, for other jurisdictions in Australia going forward.
Thank you, sir.
It's not just environmental defenders that we need to protect, it is also those that work in environmental agencies as well, because there have been incidences around Australia where staff have been killed undertaking their work.
I think that's all the time we have
Yeah,
for
and
Q&A.
I would just say I would include those, yeah.
I'm going to hand over now to Rebecca Vassarotti, and please join us for lunch afterwards, but over to you.
Thanks so much, Helen, and thank you, everyone. I won't take too long because there's never good to get in between a group of people and lunch. So look, yuma to all of you, and thank you so much, Mary, for your welcome to country. And I would like just to also say Darua Nuna, Darua Ngunnawal. We are here on the land of the Ngunnawal people and meeting on Ngunnawal land, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I think in sitting and listening to this very eminent panel, and particularly the words of Mary, we have so much to learn from our First Nations teachers, and I thank you for your ongoing and generous teaching for me and other people within this community. So thank you so much for that. This has been a really insightful and reflective and important conversation for me, and I hope for all of you. I was really struck by the fact that it was 50 years. It's 50 years since we, started having this conversation globally until we actually got the resolution in the General Committee, and even here in the ACT, it has taken us some time to get to this point. But we are really excited that we have got to this point. But, I think we are really conscious that time is running out when we look at, the reports that Dr Lewis spoke about, particularly in terms of the dual crisis we are facing in terms of the climate crisis and the extinction crisis, that this is the time to act, and this certainly is a right that's time is probably overdue, not only has come. So we are, I am really excited that we are taking this leadership role here in the ACT. And when we think about the air that we breathe and the water that we drink and the environment that we inhabit, often we do take it for granted. But, whether it be the impacts of climate change, the impacts of pollution, the loss of environmental values, it has become really clear that we need to work more actively to protect these rights and these essentials to life. We know that there is the connection between our own health and well-being, and it's not just about us. This is about all living creatures which rely on environment for food, clean air, soil, water and habitat. And we know the environment works really hard. It is delivering these essential services such as pollination, soil fertility, pest and weed control, culture and recreation, and medicines that are irreplaceable if we do lose them. We do have a national system of environment protection that we know has been failing. And so it is really exciting to see finally the federal government is moving in this area, and I'll reflect the comments that were made by Minister Cheyne in terms of how significant this is. Issues such as actually having strong national environment standards, actually having an independent environment protection agency, and importantly compliance will be really significant. But there's a lot of hard work to be done, and as I reiterated before, we are running out of time. This discussion has highlighted that we really need to think about what we're doing across the system, not just about our environmental laws, but how we craft other laws, such as the planning laws that we were just talking about, our transport system, our building regulations, our workplace laws, and all of the other laws. I think this is one of the really big opportunities of the right to a healthy environment, because it will embed this thinking, not just in terms of our environmental laws, but in terms of other laws. We have seen the impact of our commitment to climate action starting to permeate again slowly in some of our other laws. And we were talking about the issue of heat island effect, particularly with the densification in our cities. And we did a lot of work over this year in terms of getting new requirements in for how you developed private spaces in current suburbs around ensuring that there were trees, there was commitments around permeable spaces in terms of private open space to really be addressing that. We were able to do that because of our commitments around climate change, and I really see that the right to a healthy environment will enable us to progress these conversations more. So I would reiterate what Dr. Lewis says. Sometimes these things don't happen in the right sequence potentially, but it's absolutely a lens that many of us are putting on when we are looking at some of the really significant reform that is happening at the moment. In the area of building regulation is one that I have responsibility for, and we've been really looking at in terms of increasing our environmental efficiency in the buildings that we are building now that will be around for decades to come. The protection of environment and human health are a real priority for the ACT government. And as Minister Cheyne noted, we are reviewing our environment protection framework for the ACT, and we're looking at what we need to do better. Again, when I reflect on what a right to a healthy environment might do in terms of some of this work, I think it does a few things. It actually increases our expectations. It also enables us to argue for more resources, and that in turn helps us around compliance. So these are real life practical things that I think will flow from us adopting a right to a healthy environment. Few issues are as clear an example of the connection between health and the environment as the quality of the air we breathe, and we've touched on it briefly in some of the questions that were asked. And I've really been thinking about the work that we are doing around bushfire, smoke and air quality, and how we are really working across environment and health on these issues. And we need to continue to engage with the community on some of these key issues. And while tobacco smoke is one, wood fire smoke is also another one that we've been really thinking about in terms of how we protect our more vulnerable community members, and how we really, grapple with the issues of climate justice in terms of some of these conversations as well. As has been noted, considering a right to a healthy environment really brings into sharp relief our intergenerational responsibilities, particularly given the challenges faced by our natural environment around biodiversity loss, threatened species protection, and the pressures on habitat and ecosystems. A key way that we will be looking at this is around our Nature Conservation Act and the development of a new strategy. We really want to ensure that in this work we really think about the issue of a right to a healthy environment for us today, for our kids tomorrow, and for future generations. The discussion around the wellbeing framework has been touched on, and I actually think this is really important because we are really working to embed our wellbeing framework that we developed in 2020 into our general approach. And what this means in relation to a right to a healthy environment is really important. We've already identified environment, climate, health, accessibility and connections as some of the key components to our overall well-being. And we're really exploring what the interconnection of these domains will be. And as we embed the framework into our policy development, our budget consideration and our overall approach to governing and administering the city, a right to a healthy environment will be really important. I'm really, really pleased that we did have a brief conversation about environmental defenders, because I do think it is a really key issue, and certainly in this country, whether it be the issues of laws that have been passed in Tasmania that are very draconian in terms of the potential penalties for environmental defenders, and the issues, the very disturbing case of Violet Coco, who is facing significant imprisonment. And I will do a little plug. I'm fairly sure there is a rally tonight at 6:30 to show our solidarity with Violet, and also to signal our concern about these kind of laws. I think that it is really important that we do stand in solidarity, and we do, we want to be a leading jurisdiction, so we have to stand up and show and bring our voices to the table when we see things that we are really concerned about. I'm really excited about where we are, because I think here in the ACT, touching on a question that was asked to one of the panel members, the ACT has been a leader in many of these issues, and so it's probably not a surprise that we want to be a leader here. And I think that is really significant, because we are small, but we can be a bit of a laboratory. We can actually we can test and try things and show others what we can do. In terms of our renewable energy targets, we have inspired other communities around this nation and also globally. So it's really important that we continue to do that. So I am very excited that we will be continuing to lead nationally about the importance of human rights, as well as the importance of protecting our precious environment. Throughout this discussion, we have reflected on the deep knowledge and the connections that First Nation peoples have to this country, and how in the initiatives such as this, we are effectively relearning what First Nations people have been practicing for millennia. It's a really simple message. If we look after country, it will look after us. So I'm really pleased that we'll be walking this journey and actually legislating a human right to a healthy environment. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. We'll now close, but I wanted to thank all panellists and the staff of the Human Rights Commission for organising this event, and CMAG and our recording friends here. And I hope to see you next year with a right to healthy environment and a complaints mechanism by International Human Rights Day. Thank you so much.